Hello. Today is October the 12th, 2011. My name is Michael Burke, and it's my pleasure to be in Seattle, Washington, interviewing Sal Drachler as part of the Leonard and Simon's Jewish Community Archives Oral History Project. Sal, it's good to be with you. Do we have your permission to use the contents of this interview for the historic record and for educational purposes?
Yes, you do.
Good. So let's get started.
Good.
Let's talk about the beginning of your life in Detroit and the things that were most important to you. So let's talk about your family, where you were born in the city. I should ask the question. Were you born in the city?
No, I was born in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, but I arrived in Detroit when I was 2 years old. I made an early beginning.
What brought your family to Detroit?
My parents and my brother were born in Russia. My father was a Jewish educator, a regional superintendent in the province Kamenets-Podolsk in the Ukraine. He also taught, secretly opened up Yiddish schools, but he handled primarily the religious schools. When the Tsar was overthrown and a liberal socialist government came in, he became a member of the government in the education department. However, that government lasted less than a year. The Bolsheviks overthrew them, and my father and family had to flee the country. They spent 4 years in Europe, mostly, that was in 1919, mostly in Poland, but occasionally in some other Central European countries. He was a writer, a journalist. He had part-time work at a newspaper and supported the family that way. In 1924, they secured a visa to go to Canada, and a year later, they moved into the United States in the New York, New Jersey area. My father was a teacher, a Yiddish teacher in that community. I was born in 1927. In 1929, my father had an offer to teach in Detroit. He accepted the offer because he felt it would give him greater creative opportunities, particularly in terms of the writing he was doing, a good deal of it getting published. So we came to Detroit. I was still 2. We moved into the new Jewish neighborhood, Dexter, on Monterey. But within a year of our arriving in Detroit, my father had a massive stroke, which remained with him in various stages through the rest of his life. We had to find some form of support for the family. My brother was already 18. I was a little over 3 years of age. We had friends. There were a lot of Jews then in the hand laundry business. So they suggested that they would teach my brother and my mother the business, and they'd open up a laundry, which they did in the west side of Detroit, completely non-Jewish neighborhood. We moved to that area, lived a block away on West Grand Boulevard. Norman had already started Wayne University. He was studying to be a teacher. As a result of his connections or his contacts there, they arranged that I could enter the public school, kindergarten, when I was 3 and a half, with the understanding that I would stay until a year and a half plus another year of kindergarten, which we did. The neighborhood, West Grand Boulevard, was lower middle class. The surrounding streets were mostly Afro-American, almost completely Afro-American. The kids who went to the public schools, the one where I attended, weren't too well prepared for education. As a result, I got double promoted 3 times in elementary school. I entered intermediate, the 7th grade. I was 10 years old. The level of interest in education is perhaps exemplified by one time I was sitting with one of my classmates, helping him with his algebra. He knew I was fairly young, but how young are you? I said, well, I'm 10 years old. 10 and a half, I said. He said, 10 and a half years old. He says, 5.5 years before you can quit school, you know. Then I went on to Northwestern High School, and I got double promoted there too, so I arrived at Wayne before my 16th birthday. Norman, you know, was really my hero. In a sense, he was more like a father, because it was at least 3.5 years before my father was able even to be mobile, let alone speak. I just marveled at his capacity. He worked in the laundry, he went to school, to the university. He managed to look after me a little bit, bought me my first baseball bat and glove. I guess he was a person that I looked up to in my very early years.
As we all know, Norman, we'll talk about Norman a little bit
Okay.
later on. He had a pretty distinguished
Career
of his own in
Yeah.
Detroit as superintendent of the Detroit public school system.
Right.
So you might want to just have a quick 2 sentences that says, Norman is my older brother. We were 15 years
apart. Okay.
And that's it.
Yeah.
Because that would be helpful, because you
Yeah,
mentioned his name
again,
in that reason.
right.
So should we put that in now?
Now?
Yeah.
Okay. As you know, Norman was my older brother, but we were 15 years apart. My parents did have a third child in between, but the child died, you know, in infancy, so there were just the 2 of us.
So we've heard a lot about, you know, you and Norman and that part of your family, but I've heard very little about your mother. So
Well,
I'd like to hear just a few words about your mom and how she influenced you in your life growing up.
Well, as I said before, Mother was born in Russia. She came from a small family. My father's family had, there were 10 children in my father's family, 4 sons, 3 daughters. Interestingly enough, just an aside, the 4 sons all ended up in the United States, you know, the land where gold was in the streets. The 3 daughters, ended up in Palestine. They left for Palestine starting in 1908, where they were on agricultural settlements, which later became kibbutzim, and one of them became a teacher. It was rather strange that the boys all went to where the good life was, and the girls all went to where it was really a very hard existence. And my mother had a brother. All of the family either perished in Europe before World War II or in the Holocaust. My mother came from, the family was fairly well-to-do, and her new role as breadwinner, you have to remember the laundry business meant 6 days a week, from 8 in the morning till 6:30 until 9 o'clock on Saturday. There was very little home life in that context, and over the years she grew pretty embittered. She had a strong intellectual background in Russia in terms of her schooling, and she could only express it through, the Leonkreis, the reading circle, which she managed to go to when I could stay in the store for a long period of time. She outlived her husband, outlived my father by almost 20 years, and my mother and I were close, but we were always working side by side. Because of the lack of any only family life, Norman left the household when I was 10. He was married, and our family life really revolved around Sundays when we would go to Norman's for, the afternoon and dinner. My father, whose intellectual abilities and capacities were so enormous, was pretty much hobbled by what had occurred to him so early in his career.
So you had was Norman close to your mother too? Did he have a relationship with her as well?
I wasn't witness to the early years, but it was a mother-son relationship. Nothing too intense, nothing too removed, so as much as I can say about it.
And your grandparents, they stayed in,
they
never came to the...
They never came to the United States. My father's father had a small mill. He was a rather learned man and somewhat religious. My parents were secular. Our family was secular. I was never in a shul, in a synagogue. I wasn't bar mitzvahed. That didn't have meaning for them. And then, of course, it would have become very difficult based on where we lived, so far removed from the Jewish community. Though he was a religious man, my father's father, he was influenced by the Haskalah, the Enlightenment movement in Jewish life in Europe, and he became something of a Zionist. My father was a labor Zionist. In fact, he was a delegate to one of the World Zionist Congresses.
So tell me, you mentioned that your aunts moved to Israel,
Mm-hmm.
and the brothers moved. Do you still have family in Israel? And was the fact that part of your family moved to Israel, I don't want to suppose anything,
Yeah.
but I assume, knowing you a little bit, that
Mm-hmm.
your interest in Israel may have started there. So I'm curious whether or not you became interested in the whole Zionist movement back when you were a younger man.
Yeah, I was very much interested in the Zionist movement. I knew my father's position. My father was interested that I would be involved in labor Zionist activities. And it was interesting in terms of the relationship. Even though the family had been here for a short period of time, friends of the family made sure that they came by, took me to their homes in the Jewish area where I developed friendships. In the early years, made sure that I joined the Habonim, the Labor Zionist Youth Group. In that time, in that period, Yiddish and Labor Zionism was a very substantial movement in Detroit. So I became involved early. In addition to my brother, I guess my heroes were, in a sense, labor Zionist and socialist thinkers. Norman was involved in socialist activity at Wayne, together with the Reuther boys and Walter Bergman. You know, the 30s Detroit was the center of a very virulent anti-Semitism, what with Father Coughlin, Gerald L.K. Smith, and I was very impressed with how my brother dealt with those problems together with those issues, together with his friends and colleagues at the university.
So who were some of those people you talked about? Obviously, we know that Norman was your most important influence, but who were some of the other people who helped maybe shape the way you thought about things?
You know, while I was able to get to these things, I couldn't spend a lot of time. I had to be at the laundry to help Mother. You know, I started in the laundry before there were child labor laws, so I was 8 years old. And as a result, I really had only one mentor, an older person by the name of Danny Ginsberg, who introduced me to these labor Zionist and socialist thinkers and helped me. I was the leader of a group in Habonim, helped me with my sichot, my lectures. Beyond that, other than, you know, the other thing that happened to me in my early childhood, after my father's stroke, I got sent off to a summer camp for 10, 12 weeks when I was, you know, I wasn't 4 yet. Friends of the family, friends of the movement, and I spent my summers in camps in my early years, up until adolescence. And one of my heroes there was Moshe Har, a name you may know. He was the cultural director of the camp, and because of my knowledge of and fluency in Yiddish, which I acquired not from any school. I never attended a Yiddish school. I spoke Yiddish maybe even before I spoke English, but that was the language in the household. And as a result, he used me in every theatrical production he produced, whether out at summer camp or back in Detroit, and turned me into a star, you know. And he was a fascinating, interesting man. He had served in World War II, was wounded, became a pacifist, so his thoughts and his care for me was a big factor in my early years. Well, I'm sorry?
Shape you?
Yeah, right, in my early years.
Is the Ginsberg family still represented in Detroit?
No. He had a brother who was a prominent biologist, did work in Maine, and Danny Ginsberg himself enlisted in the Marines, became a lieutenant and was killed in the Pacific Theater the same month that I enlisted in the Navy.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you went. You said you went to school very early.
I'm
just wondering what
that
you
was,
went to study.
Well, my interest was in chemistry, and I enjoyed qualitative and quantitative chemistry. When it came to organic chemistry, I began to lose interest, and I was but I had a facility with numbers, you know, not great mathematics, but I added up all the laundry bills, you know, that the customers brought before I was 10. So I thought maybe I'll go into accounting, and just as I was beginning to move in that direction or think about going in that direction, I got a call from the Jewish Parents Institute. Would I be interested in being a club leader and maybe taking on some other responsibilities there? The Parents Institute was an experiment of the Jewish Center, started after World War II.
How old were you then?
I was then, well, it was 49?
So you're 20 years old.
I had reached 20, that's for sure.
So you might want to just start with, in my 20s, I had joined or was part of this.
Yeah,
Just as
yeah. In my 20s, when I was considering moving into another discipline, another interest, which was accounting, I got this call from the Jewish Community Center about leading a group, the oldest group in the program, and taking some other responsibilities. I decided to accept that. It was an experimental program that the center started for families, parents who were not religious, had not attended any religious institutions. That's one of the things that appealed to me, that helped me in the decision to accept the offer. And also there was largely a very liberal group. Some of the people who were friends of Norman's were in that organization. So I accepted the assignment. I continued to work in the laundry. We didn't get rid of the laundry until after I came to Federation, which was about late in 1956. So then I became the co-director of Jewish Parents Institute at the center, and Irwin Shaw, I think Irwin was then the executive. I don't remember, it may have been Jacobs, I'm not sure, asked whether I would do some adult education at the center, lead a book group, etc., which I accepted. So I had a full-time position at the center when I got a call in, as I said, late 1956 from the Federation. Would I be interested in being the secretary of the Education Division, one of the budgeting and planning divisions of the Federation, and also, by the way, doing some fundraising.
Who called you? Who made that call?
I'm not sure who was. One of the people it may have been Bill of Runnon who made that call, but it was preceded by one of the members of the Jewish Parents Institute was the controller of the Federation at that time, Ingram Bander.
I
You remember him. He told me that he asked me whether I'd be interested, and he told me I'd be getting a call.
Now, how did Irwin Shaw play a role in your
It was
life?
fairly limited. Irwin Shaw was, I think, my father-in-law, Michael Michlin, I think was his Hebrew school teacher. And I married Michael's daughter, Leah Michlin. So there was some connection there. He knew who I was, he knew Norman, but he was not, the Jewish Parents Institute was sort of an experimental program that an associate director began, a rather radical, rather liberal associate director. I'm not sure the center was overly excited about it, but it became a rather substantial program. So Irwin never showed up at Jewish Parents Institute meetings or functions, and they were not too eager to, it was mutual.
So this was before you got married?
No, I got married in 1950.
So how did you
Leah,
how did you meet Leah? And tell us a little bit about that, and
let's
maybe
see.
a word or two about your family and back then.
Yeah,
We'll talk
yeah,
about
right.
that some more a little bit.
Leah, this was 1950. that I married Leah. I met her, she came to a labor Zionist meeting. When I came back from the Navy, I'd been in Habonim from my early years, and was a little bit of a leader there. I was the co-signer on the land contract for the Habonim camp that they organized. And Leah came to one of the, let me back up a moment. One of the early things I did after coming back from the Navy was to organize a new branch of the Labor Zionists, Branch 11, the Daniel Yosef branch, named for the two men who were active when I was a youngster in Habonim. And she came, and I met her then. At that time, the Labor Zionist movement had a building. We had programs. We had onegim, oneg Shabbat every week. So, we danced the hora, of which she was part of the circle, and we would go out afterwards, 6, 8 of us, she among them, and gradually we developed a rather closer relationship. And then she became a counselor. She was the counselor. She was the singing instructor at Farban camp, Labor Zion, a camp of the Labor Zionist movement, actually the National Workers Alliance, but it was all part of the one movement. And our relationship grew there, and that was in 49, and within a year, the relationship was close enough for her to tell me after one New Year's Eve party, when someone handed me a drink that was a little too alcoholic for me, that I had proposed to her. So we got married. Yeah. As I started to say, her mother and father were well known in the community. Father was an educator, taught at the United Hebrew Schools, was a principal at the United Hebrew Schools. Her mother was equally well known. Chana Michlin was a leader in the Pioneer Women, now known as Naamat. So it all fit together, except for the fact that they were Hebraeus.
You were Yiddishist.
And we were Yiddishist, a little bit of a Kulturkampf, but and the Yiddishists were predominant then. But we swallowed our pride, and we agreed to move forward with the wedding.
So tell me about your in-laws and the influence that they had on you.
Well,
as you were...
I'll tell you, in our relationship, they were two fascinating people. Michael, let me call him Michael. That's how we addressed him, both, at least that's the way I addressed him. He was quite learned, a gentle soul. He was very effective with young people. When we would go to a Seder with the children, I'll say this even before I've introduced the children, our kids, Leah's and mine, he had the boys still remember the stories he told, historical stories about about Passover and Jewish history. He was, what was the English film in the early years, Mr. Chips or someone?
Goodbye, Mr.
Yeah,
Chips.
Goodbye, Mr. Chips. Well, hello, Mr. Michlin. In any case, her mother, Hannah, was a very effective organizer, an extraordinary cook. That's what really furthered our relationship, Leah's and mine. When I would leave Wayne State from classes in the evening, I took the Dexter bus. The Dexter bus took me to Grand River and Dexter, where I would catch the West Grand Boulevard bus to go home. I always wrestled with the proposition, should I get off and hop on the Boulevard bus, or should I continue the bus to Glendale because that's where Leah lived? Well, Leah and Hannah's cooking always, because whenever I came there, no matter what time it was, she had a meal for me. But she was a pretty, I won't say brilliant organizer, but if there hadn't been a glass ceiling in America for women, she could have been an executive in almost any enterprise. She worked in behalf of the pioneer women in Israel. And my father-in-law, Michael, was very active in the Jewish National Fund. So it all fit together pretty much hand in glove.
Did the unions play any part in your upbringing and growing up? Detroit was such a strong union town, and
only
Jews were very involved in the
union. Only in the in relation to, I mean, I knew the Histadrut, the Israeli labor union. I wasn't really involved with any of not at that early age. Later on, when I was at Federation, I did spend some time with people from Ford Local 600, which was the Ford Local, but that was incidental. It was not at all central.
A little bit more about Leah in terms of what her career was.
Yeah, her degrees led her to do social work and then teaching. She was an elementary school teacher. She was also, by the way, a Hebrew school teacher before, in the early years of our marriage. She taught Hebrew school at the United Hebrew School branch at Adat Shalom on Curtis and Livernois. Her Hebrew was pretty substantial at that point. Not as good as her older sister, who spoke Hebrew before she spoke English. As I said, they were Hebraeus, and it was exemplified by everything in their household and the way the their children behaved.
Was there any thought between you and she of ever making Aliyah or going to Israel?
No, there was not. Your mentioning Israel reminds me, you asked whether we had family. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Yeah. My older aunt, with her husband, were founders of Kfar Giladi, kibbutz in northern Israel. They were there. They lived their entire lives there, but they were good, strong Zionists and Hebraeus. And I remember on my first visit to them,
when was that, son?
I was at Federation already, probably with one of the early missions that I took. I came to the kibbutz and I sought her out, and Hebrew? I didn't know Hebrew, not at all. Leah wasn't with me, so she couldn't help. But I said, I know Yiddish. She knew a little bit of English, enough to get that far in the conversation, and I said, I know Yiddish, and it was pretty good Yiddish. I could, as I would often say, I can hold a referat, I can deliver a report in Yiddish, which I did occasionally. But she called in her husband and a couple of her children and said, listen, in Hebrew, which they later translated for me, that red jargon, he's speaking a jargon, not a legitimate language, Yiddish, and they wanted her to hear it. I mean, that's how strong the Kulturkampf between the two languages and the two groups of people was. And it was obviously wise. They wanted to create a national language, and no matter what Yiddish scholars or prominent Yiddish authors would do to try and influence them to have Yiddish more present. Remember our outstanding literary figure Pinsky went and with funds that he brought created the Golden Acate, the Golden Chain, a Yiddish journal, but it didn't last very long. And one of the other ants was established in the Negev. The name of the kibbutz escapes me, but it was a major kibbutz, one which Golda Meir retired to. And the third ant was killed in an air raid, I think, during World War II.
So is there still family in Israel?
Large numbers of people. One of the sons was one of the grandsons of my aunt was a economist and the secretary of the kibbutz movement, and also obviously a fairly prominent economist. He would come and teach at Wharton and other universities here for a semester or two, and we developed a rather close relationship, as well as I had with some of the grandchildren of our three aunts. I'd say the family numbers in Kfar Galadi, we don't predominate, but very large numbers. We couldn't bring gifts, but so we remember leaving, 13, 18, 20-some little checks, for their children.
Do you still keep in contact at all? Is there
Limited, pretty limited, yeah.
So let's talk about your kids.
Sorry. I'm sorry. Do you want a little sip of water?
You want
No, you're okay.
No,
Okay.
fine.
Sure.
Thank you. No.
Are we doing okay?
We're doing terrific.
Yeah, we have
So we're talking about your children.
the children, two sons. They are both attorneys. So my entire family and all four grandchildren, our entire family and all four grandchildren live in Seattle. So that made our coming here a rather easy decision. It came a little earlier than we had planned because we were about to leave Sutton Place in Southfield, Leah and I, where we had an apartment, and move out to West Bloomfield. And we said to one another, does it make sense to move, twice in a couple of years? So we came here early, we got in the car, and we drove.
So tell me, I know a little bit about what it's like to have kids growing up in a family where the father is a Jewish communal professional, particularly a Federation professional.
Well,
so how did your work impact on your family and impact on your kids, particularly as they were growing up? Did they have any interest in following in your footsteps?
No.
Obviously, they're both attorneys.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. They were both had a very liberal orientation. Paul at Ann Arbor even flirted with the SDS for a while. Students for a Democratic Society, I think it was.
That's what it is.
Yeah, and the idea of while they had visited Israel and were very taken with what was taking place there. They were like liberal Seattle, in their orientation. No, they didn't have any inclination in that direction. Fortunately, they're both very light sleepers, and when I would come home from a meeting, I could sit. Occasionally, when I'd come home from a meeting, I could sit on the edge of the bed and have a conversation with them. Mm-hmm. I made sure, because I had heard from my nephew that Norman never had time to go to any of his basketball games or anything of that nature, so I made sure that I was around for that. And I early on developed an allergy to grasses, so I taught them how to push a mower, and we spent good times together that way.
Good.
Yeah.
So let's go back. It sounds to me that it wasn't a plan to get into Jewish communal service for you. It just
No,
it sort of happened.
It sort of happened, although our life was very Jewish, even though we were far removed from the Jewish community. I grew up listening to the Weinberg and Altman Yiddish hours. My father, when he was a little better, would give me a Yiddish book to read to him and help me along in it. And what did he give me? The history of the Jewish labor movement in the United States. So I was
like reading.
Yeah. And I was witness to Mrs. Weinberg's oft-quoted incident where in 1940, when Wendell Willkie was running against FDR, against Roosevelt for the presidency, at one point there was a bar of music played, and she came on and said, "Ihr sollt alle gehen zu the polls, dem Dienstag. You should all go to the polls this Tuesday. Und ihr sollt voten for Wendell Willkie for president." And then she said, "Ich allein will voten for Roosevelt," which translates into, you should all go to the polls on Tuesday, vote for Willkie. I myself am voting for Roosevelt. Yeah. At any rate, yeah.
Okay,
so it was a strong Jewish life, and one that was fascinating and pleasant and progressive. Yeah.
So you had obviously you had the base. So
Yeah.
So you came to the Federation.
I came to the Federation.
In this kind of bifurcated, half planning, half.
Yeah.
What were your impressions of the Federation at that time and the Jewish community at that time from the perspective of someone just entering into the field?
Two things. One of the things that struck me early on was the fact, as I began to look back at Federation minutes of earlier years, board meeting minutes, the fact that so many of our leaders had such staying power. They were leaders and active in the 30s, and they were still around in the 50s and 60s, and that seemed rather extraordinary to me. And I subsequently decided there were two factors. One was the United Foundation. At the end of World War II, four people sat down, the three chairmen of the automotive companies and Walter Reuther, the president of the United Auto Workers. And they made a decision that employees should contribute to the torch drive, the United Foundation's annual campaign. Well, there were hundreds of thousands of employees in the area, and a worker would take out 50 cents a paycheck, $1 a paycheck, $5 a paycheck. Well, it added up multiplied by a couple 100,000 to a very substantial sum. As a result, the United Foundation was the strongest by far in the country, and it provided very well for social agencies. So they didn't need Jewish philanthropy, in quotes, to be involved, along with the fact that there were some very wealthy people from the automotive industry and from the lumber industry, the earlier industry, and also from the fishing industry, who were patrons of organizations and the arts. I remember once meeting with the director of the art museum, and I walk into his office, and there's a letter on the wall that he had framed. It was from Charlotte Ford, closed with a check for $1 million. It was a very interesting meeting, etc. So, like Skillman, you know, the 3M executive, I've forgotten her first name, but whatever it was, they were very generous to some Jewish institutions as well, particularly Fresh Air Society. But when there was a need, there were extremely wealthy people who stepped forward. So Jews weren't involved, and that was in the early years. That changed dramatically in the late 70s and 80s, when the automotive industry sort of caved in, or at least the beginning of the decline of the automotive industry, because what they did was, as long as workers were getting a paycheck, there was payroll deduction. And the United Foundation was able to say, you know, this amount of money over 26 weeks will be so much, but if a worker is laid off, they won't be any money, we'll reduce the amount. But in the late 70s and early 80s, they weren't being laid off. They were being let go. The automotive industry was downsizing, and they were in trouble, and institutions were in trouble, and financially, and cultural institutions as well. At that point, Jews began to become more prevalent in the nonprofit sector, nonprofit area of Detroit. That was not the case in the early post-war years. They were involved in the pre-war years. It was a different era. But in the post-war, it wasn't payroll deduction. But in the post-war years, the early post-war years, they weren't involved. And that made for a significant difference. It was totally unique in the country. The well-to-do did not have to support the United Foundation. I think I mentioned to you and to others, I would say to Sobe, you know, Saturday's paper, there's a list of contributors to the Torch Drive, the UF fundraising, the name of the UF fundraising drive, and it lists remember the name of the family that sold their early stock back to Ford for $25 million, the Cousins family, extremely wealthy family. There were 500, they list them with pride as a $500 contributor. So the climate, the environment was totally different, totally unique. That was not true. So much so that when I was doing some helping the United Foundation deal with the problems that confronted them after the 80s, when I left the Federation, it was very hard to get major gifts functioning in that wasn't true in other cities. We looked at what they were doing in Cleveland or in Los Angeles. You know, they had clubs at $5,000 and $10,000. Even in Columbus, the fellow who has the Limited and other Jewish owner, you know, would invite 150 people to the country club, non-Jews as well as Jews, you know, for a $5,000 function. I don't know if I should say it publicly, but you could count on one hand maybe 1.5 hands, the number of $10,000 givers that there were on 2 hands, because when I was counting them, Max Fisher had already been the first non-automotive, non-Christian chairman of the United Foundation. So he brought in the Hamburgers and Tom Borman and
Maxwell Jospe.
Well, the Hamburger family was the Jospe, yeah. So maybe there were 10 at the very most. So that was extraordinary. And when I suggested a $5,000 minimum for a major gift, I was told later that the chairman, who was also the chairman of General Motors, said, yes, we have executives, in 6 figures, but they have to give to the church, and that it's too much. So I developed a pilpul. I said, look, let's do it for $2,000 the first year, $3,000 the next year, 4, and then 5, and they'll see that they don't have to make any sacrifice, So what ended up is that that didn't work entirely, because later on I saw that they had instituted each category. There were donors at the $3,000 level, at the $4,000 level, and the $5,000. They didn't move forward. So that was the first thing that sort of caught my eye when I was at the Federation. And of course, I came there at a time when the Jewish neighborhood were changing. It was no longer Dexter, although Dexter, served the Jewish community for almost a generation. Yeah. We arrived there in 1929. It was a new neighborhood, and this was already 1957. Northwest Detroit, was where Jews were moving. Those were the, other than the very impressive leaders of the Federation, professional leaders.
We'll talk about that in a second, but I'm curious.
Yeah.
What was your impression of Jews supporting Jewish issues and Jewish causes when you came on board?
Well,
you had some experience beforehand, but this was, the community's support for, for our infrastructure. What was your impressions back then? And who were the movers and shakers in the volunteer world that helped move the philanthropic agenda forward?
Yeah. Well, we'll say a few words about the executive leadership of the Federation later on, as you said. There were 2 reactions. Outside of Federation, my friends, viewed Federation as the boys downtown, Jewish or not. Jews, they were the enemy. You had to be careful. I learned one thing very early, and that became kind of a focus for me, that the Allied Jewish campaign, not identified with the Federation, even though it was the Federation fundraising, was well received and popular. And I decided early that I would try to make the Allied Jewish campaign into like a shul, a place where people belong to the campaign, and it was easy to do. As you know, we had 100 sections, and I insisted each section, occasionally 2 sections together, should have meetings, and they were generally home meetings, except for the furniture boys who met in the furniture club, but that was their home.
Right.
And the campaign became almost an all year round activity, and it was important. I thought to myself, except for those people who go, the Yiddish movement, the labor Zionist movement, those movements were shrinking rather dramatically. And I decided, early on And they belonged to congregations. Some did go more, some went less, but it wasn't central. And I felt you could kind of transform the campaign. We had the meetings in people's homes. They enjoyed that. The leader enjoyed being the host. And in the Furniture Club, we used to get together frequently. I mean, they were there to play cards, but they would all do campaign business. And it was the kind of business where they could be actively involved. Every section meeting, and the workers and the leadership came together. What a wonderful opportunity to talk about the people who weren't there and their capacity to give, and who would be most effective with them. And the job could be completed. You worked within the Federation. There was an awful lot of emphasis on process. You know, they had difficulty tolerating that, even though they were involved. So that was one of the early conclusions. That
there was also a social component to it.
Absolutely, absolutely. They became closer, and that got expressed most fully during the Yom Kippur War in the fall of '73.
Right.
Yeah, we started remember that we started our campaign in '73. We had 2 meetings every single week until, for weeks on end, with well over 100 people there each time. And people who had not been good, in quotes, contributors to the campaign, who were influencing one another as to how much they give. I remember one person getting up, made a $30,000 gift, had been a $1,000 giver for years, and very difficult. And he got up, made a speech about, come on, you guys, you have to get to your feet, etc. It was a way to build identity. It was a way to teach. It was a way to provide social responsibility, which leads me to a question I'd like to put to my questioner, who I assume would have been visible in this program if we were wearing suspenders. But since he's not wearing suspenders, he can't be shown. I was a little disappointed when I heard about the name change, that it was now the annual campaign of the Jewish Federation. I felt that diminished the effectiveness, that I was trying to build in terms of mass participation. It didn't affect major giving, but the numbers of individual contributors diminished considerably. Some part may be related to that, but mostly related to the change in the Jewish economic structure. There were no longer so many businesses, retail businesses owned by Jews, and when the Jew owned a business, we got contributions from the workers. Even when they didn't own a business, I remember two of the people at J.L. Hudson coming over to the store, 2 Jewish fellows. We'll go around and collect for the campaign. I don't know if they would have come over to tell me we'll go around and collect for the Federation. The campaign was identified with Jewish need and Jewish causes and Israel. The Federation was viewed as an oligarchy, so, and of course with my friends, I wondered how could I do it, no matter how reason didn't prevail.
Did it ever affect friendships?
No.
Good.
Yeah. No. Your question about some of the people who I worked with, those I had to jot down quickly. The last 2 or 3 days, I wrote down,
Before you get into
Yeah.
the people.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
I just have one question. The concept that you promoted in the in the Federation,
Yeah.
which I of course grew up with and
You
subscribed.
suffered with.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
Everyone should suffer so
Yeah.
much. My question is, was that a hard sell in the community?
It varied.
Was it a hard sell for the
It wasn't
professional leadership? Was it a hard sell?
It was a harder
for the
sell.
volunteers?
It was a little harder sell for the professional leadership than it was for the lay leadership. Lay leadership were available. We had an army of workers. We didn't have as many generals as I would like, competent generals, but we had an army of workers, and they didn't say, "God, another meeting." You rarely heard that. So that's what encouraged me even more. Later on, when I was the executive, I felt comfortable devoting more time there and to a lot of little projects that I had in mind, because there was a very competent associate director, Sam Cohn, who was an excellent social worker. I wish he had been a little more pragmatic. I always felt he was a little bit of a prisoner of his principles, and overly committed to process. But that was just a different orientation. But I felt comfortable in terms of his dealing with the agencies and the other portion of Federation responsibility.
So let's go. I don't want to put you in a bad place because you may miss a name or two, but I'm going to push you on it. Who were the volunteer mentors?
Yeah,
that you had the best. That's best.
It's endless.
The closest relation.
Yeah.
Who influenced you?
Yeah. Well, the influences were varied, and we worked with some very successful and talented people. Hard to separate out. I looked down somewhere. I wrote them down. I think of, obviously, I have to start with Sobey and Bill.
Okay, so now we're in the professional.
Yeah.
So let's talk about
no question about Detroit. When I took executive responsibility at the Federation in '76, although Sam and I were sort of co-directors, maybe 2 years earlier, Bill of Runnin, his illness and his convalescence kept him away, if you recall. When I took leadership, Detroit Federation had 40 years of separate and joint leadership by Sobey and Bill.
So tell people who don't.
Isidore Sobolov became the executive director of the Federation in 1937. He was a brilliant organizer, brilliant fundraiser, very, very skilled, extremely bright. He also knew Yiddish. That appealed to me. We used to occasionally, he was a wordsmith. He had worked somewhere along the way with H.L. Mencken, and his first work was in public relations in New York, I believe. As a wordsmith, he would fill me in on words like logorrhea, when one of our, occasionally a professional, but more frequently a lay leader was talking too long, too much. He said, it's a disease, it's logorrhea. I'd never heard that before. He usually would query me about a Yiddish word that he wasn't sure of, even though I knew he had Weinrach's dictionary at hand, and he had an open door. And he enjoyed that kind of thing. He was the dean of the field. He was the dean of the professional world by far, acknowledged and recognized as that. Bill of Runnin came to the Federation in 1948, after the war, maybe it was 47, 48, I think. He was a social worker par excellence. These two men, together and separately, Sobey from 37 till 64, with Bill being there from 48 to 64, and then Bill from 64 till 76. 40 years. That was an extraordinary gift to the community and to me. You know, Sobey developed, first of all, he dealt with the Depression years, 37, 38, 40, all the way up to the World War. The World War, American participation in World War II. He dealt with the anti-Semitism that was then, and he developed the contours of the social service community. He added a Jewish family service, he added the Jewish Home for Aged, and he developed the Big Gift program. Then when Bill came on after World War II, you know, he added the Jewish Vocational Service. I don't know when the Hebrew Free Loan, you know that better than I as an officer, the free loan when he came on, when they came aboard. What other, I think, other groups that was he involved with early on? Well, one of the things the two of them did was, I mentioned the Histadrut. They did something which no other community in the country was able to do. Not that the Histadrut was that strong everywhere else as it was in Detroit, because of the labor orientation in the Jewish world and the general community. But they ran separate campaigns, and they ran campaigns among sought gifts from many of the big givers from the Federation community. So there was, you know, kind of a conflict there.
Right.
Well, they worked out a formula where there'd be one campaign run by the Federation. A small part of what was collected would take care of Federation overhead, and there would be a split of the remaining funds. That made for peace. The Schumers and the Shavers, you know, were able to make that gift, and it took care of their Histadrut pledge, and it took care of a part of their Federation pledge. It was extraordinary.
Revolutionary.
Yeah, even more so was there, I mentioned earlier, the community was moving to the northwest, which meant the synagogues were moving to the northwest. And part of the Federation was the United Hebrew Schools. They transformed the United Hebrew Schools into a communal school system, one of only two in the country that had two communities in the country that had a communal school system. I think Milwaukee, or may have been the other, Minneapolis, but relatively small. And in the most ingenious way, they said to the congregations, it wasn't easy for congregations to raise money for a building. One of the first things they would do was build a school. Federation leadership, mostly in the form of Runnan and Sobey occasionally, would come and say, look, the United Hebrew Schools is expanding into this area. We don't want to build a building a half a mile from you or a mile from you. Let the United Hebrew Schools run your weekday school, 4-day-a-week school. Their teachers, it'll be part of their program. You won't have the responsibility, financial responsibility for that. And the carrot, in addition to not having to pay that, we will give you 10 years advance rental in one bite. Well, that was so. In a half a dozen congregations, the United Hebrew Schools, you know, expanded. They were exceptional leaders. In Bill's day, they added the Jewish Community Council. Sobey, I didn't have a role in this, but since we were talking, Sobey didn't believe there should be a Jewish Federation apartments. I said to him, he said, I don't think we should be taking government money to build low-cost housing. That's a general community project. He just wasn't sure that it was the right thing to do. I said, Sobey, you know what's happening? I don't know if you saw the notice. I assume he did. He behaved as if he didn't. B'nai B'rith is going to build taking money to build a low-cost housing, I think was called Freedom Hall or something or other, downtown Detroit. There are going to be a handful of Jews who will live in downtown Detroit. It can't be a Jewish community for them, no Jewish services, anything else. Yeah, but Bill of Runnin saw it differently and convinced the Federation leadership that we should have it, and it's now one of the larger, least costly agencies of the Federation, and one that provides extraordinary service to the senior Jewish community. Similarly, Sobey and I had the conversation. Sobey didn't want that the UJA should establish a young leadership cabinet in Detroit. He said to me, "It's a Trojan horse." I said, "Sobey, it's true. When you're involved in a national organization, you will have some loyalties that may conflict, with the local community, the local federation. But you can trust the boys. There'll be some arguments, but that's good. We want another place for them to be involved. It'll make them better donors and better leaders." Well, it wasn't a big issue for him. It was just his inclination, not to have it. So that was great. What kind of assets did I bring? Well, I didn't have to bring much. The Federation was a piece of cake in those years. My assets were largely in 3M, as I used to tell people. I had math skills. A number of the leaders were always impressed that at every meeting, when it concluded, I knew the total and the percentage increase. That made me a winner. The second M was memory. And when I was in the Navy, I was going to go to V12, and they gave you a variety of tests, and they said, you have close to a photographic memory based on my ability to identify. But then the war, while I was still in boot camp, the war ended in Europe in April, and they said no more V12. They sent me off to San Francisco, the Naval Supply Post Office, Naval Post Office, where I was in a section where I helped direct where the mail would go, what APO it would go to, because a ship was going to be, docking there. And after 6-7 months there, living in a hotel and going to work, from 9 to 5, they sent me to Pearl Harbor. It was 4 years after the Japanese were there. They felt it was safe enough for me, because in boot camp I'd already been tagged. We had one occasion where we had to go to the rifle range, and I don't know what the hell it was. I took the bullet, I put it in and it would fall out. And about the third or fourth or fifth time, the guy came along. I felt somebody grab me by the back of my uniform, pull me out, get the hell out. At any rate, and of course the third M, which the memory thing. Whenever somebody came to a meeting, once I saw the name, I knew what his gift was. I remembered. So the third M, of course, was modesty. It was maybe the most important one at the time. At any rate, that's what was taking place. I had known that I wasn't going to be. Well, I'll get to that later when I deal with leadership that we mentioned. The names, if I can find it on this thing that I scrawled down, because I only put initials. I have to remember what the initials stand for once I find them. Let's see, somewhere here.
While you're thinking.
Of course, after the two of them, Sobey and Bill, they're head and shoulders above anyone else because I had the most involvement with them. There was the SS Frankel. Both Sam and Stanley were extraordinarily helpful and models that I couldn't be. But there were the Francos. There was Irwin Green, also a very interesting person. Let's see. I just had it a moment ago. Between the scratching, I printed here so you'd be able to read this. You keep criticizing my writing, although I was grateful for you because I learned that you interpreted it to other staff. They couldn't read it. What else do we have here? There was Bill Berman and David Handelman and Irving Rose. Irving Rose was a special guy that, and Irving Rose. There was Lester Burton. They all had something a little different to add to my experience. David Hermelin and Dan Honigman. It wouldn't be on a lot of lists because he was not a person to, although he recognized, he said to me when he became chairman of the campaign, he said, you know, Sal, he said, I thought I could make a difference in terms of the fundraising, the gifts that people, particularly with a number of men that I was going to be talking to. But you know, the campaign's an institution. I mentioned the Allied Jewish campaign. We may have argued occasionally over nickels and dimes, but they were ready to step forward with large sums of money. Zuckerman in another category, but he was an influence. Leonard Simons was. Josby was an extraordinary guy, and really the bedrock of that hamburger business. The hamburgers were, for many years, the largest contributors, to the campaign. Davidson, he was extraordinary. No chairman was able to move a meeting along like Bill. It was the Yom Kippur War. We had planning meetings, assignment meetings, in addition to the 2 fundraising meetings each. And someone would raise something, and Bill, he would raise something that had been discussed at a previous meeting and a decision made. And Bill was the only chairman who, the guy wanted to say something, I guess, get to his feet, and Bill would say, look, we discussed that previously, we made a decision, we have to move on. And, he was riveted, I could see why he was who he was. Marty Citrin, who was a very thoughtful guy, and my feeling, he was my first president, I think, when I was the executive, and I felt I could just meet with Citrin and tell him my point of view, and he would be able to get it across and sell it. And he was very articulate, he was very thoughtful fella. Fisher, I don't have to say he was an extraordinary person. The remarkable thing about him was his ability to achieve collective action. It's largely because no one used power like Max did. No one used it more effectively. It wasn't with a club, although he could club. What happened was he was no longer that involved. He was a national, international figure, but he wanted to know what was going on. So he would have me come over to the office, and we'd sit in his office, and with a milkshake and a tuna sandwich, and he wouldn't take calls, but occasionally he would take a call from Kissinger, occasionally a call from Mayor Coleman Young, and he was doing the talking, Both of those fellas could talk, but he was doing the talking.
Yeah, more than 1 or 2 presidents call him, too.
Yeah. Fisher was, and he liked the fact that I could announce totals. He was more impressed with the fact that I knew the amounts of money. And then I had a fortuitous thing with him. Project Renewal, if you recall, was a project of his. He wanted to develop something that in which people related more closely to Israel, to a city in Israel. And he and Al made a joint gift, and Ed Rose wanted to make a gift, and didn't know anything about Project Renewal, and I don't think the boys knew anything either. But we decided that if he would make a gift, we'd make it the Project Renewal. So he wanted a school somewhere, so we made it in Ofakim, some little hamlet in the Negev. So I told Fisher when we were getting together that I have a Project Renewal gift from Ed Rose. Oh yeah, how much? $500,000. That was the same size gift as he and Taubman together gave. Oh, who the hell is he? You know. And when I told him Irving, you know, he knew. So he was pleased with that. And that's really the only real context we had. You know, I had contacts with, well, Averin Cohn. And by the way, Averin Cohn, I used to see him here when he would come to lecture at the law school at the University of Washington, yeah. But he was involved with another one of the people who I worked with frequently, Tilly Brandwine. Tilly was an exceptional woman, gifted, and she got Averin to make a gift in honor of his father, Irwin, who to do a list of Jews in Michigan in cemeteries. And Tilly ran that program by herself. She got people to go to cemeteries in upstate Michigan and everywhere to record Jewish names. I don't know whether the project ever got completed, but she worked on it for some time. In addition to, well, Jane Sherman, she was beginning to, you know, to appear on the national scene and a little bit on the local scene. But she was interesting in terms of how she pressed an issue, in terms of she wanted answers to questions, but she didn't easily accept them. She was an interesting personality, and of course she's grown enormously since then. Connie Giles was a person who you couldn't help not being influenced by. And who else? You remember others. And the last person was Mike Zeltzer, who was president, the second three-year president. I'd known Mike a good deal. He was a labor Zionist. I'd known him a good deal before I came to the Federation. And it was fortuitous in the sense that when I came to the Federation, when I became the executive, there were things going on in my life and at home, and I didn't spend money at the Federation, and neither Leah nor I spent it at home, and even though we were very limited wage earners, we were pretty comfortable in terms of what we wanted, and I knew that I said to myself, half a dozen years maybe. And by 78, I was already clocking our total needs and our assets, and I knew there was no reason why I couldn't leave. And I began to see, I felt, you know, I'll meet with a few of the organizations in town to counsel them on fundraising, because I saw many of the same people I was working with in the Federation were moving there to be of assistance. And so I ended up meeting for longer or shorter periods with about 40 different groups all in the city. And Mike, the bank, his savings and loan bank, and Al Deutsch's, was going through failure. the boom in the real estate market at that time, and he was looking for something to do. And he said to me, I was at the Council of Federations, to see if there's something that they think I could do either here or they with them or somewhere else. And I thought, this is a wonderful opportunity. He will he's certainly knowledgeable enough to be able to handle the Federation in a transition until they go through 3 other executives to find the right one, Bob. So it worked out very nicely. The other thing during my administration that, we had the bicentennial, 1776, 1976. I think, I know Charlotte Dubin worked on that, and I think maybe Sharon. She did? Yeah, Sharon Alterman. That was an interesting thing. And then, of course, we had the General Assembly in Detroit. So that was one of the projects I fooled around with in my years. I wrote down a few of the others. Of course, I was tried before I was the executive even, when the JARC came to buy the home that the Federation owned on Evergreen, which was used by the National Council of Jewish Women, I think, for kind of a halfway house for young, but they no longer needed it. And I said, gee, there's every reason why, we shouldn't sell it to JARC. They're not an agency. It's a good program, etc. Norman Wackler is one of the spokesperson, and another one who was involved with the Federation in the campaign. I can't think of his name. And Sam, Frankel was ready to do it. So I did that. Sobey at that point, and even earlier, said the only one thing, he says, Drachler wants to have a friendly federation. I said, it's not a friendly federation. I want a caring federation. When we can do something that, is useful for the community, then we should do it if it doesn't divert us from our mission, Is
there anything that you wanted to do that just...
Well, there were...
that was important to you? That,
when the United Hebrew Schools and Sharet Tzedek worked out a joint project, I thought, Hebrew school enrollment was shrinking for a variety of reasons, which we're all aware of. Hard to run a school, 2 sessions, 4 to 6 and 6 to 8, and also a unionized school. It was, and when you had to go to a single session, it was impossible. But congregational, particularly in the early suburbs, Oak Parks, Southfield, etc., was shrinking, and in the synagogues. So I thought at one point, but I never did a study of it, we ought to make the synagogue a neighborhood school. We're thinking of ways the Federation could help. That'd be a neighborhood school. Children who live in the neighborhood or are unaffiliated, let them go to the school. Federation will pay for the first 2 years. After that, they have to join. If they don't join, they drop out. Well, never got around to working on that. I don't know if it would have made a difference or not. Generally, I tried to do things that I think would have a double-edged effect. I'm struggling with your printing here. My writing I can read, but printing, yeah. Some of the other things that I was involved with. As I say, the General Assembly, I talked about it from the standpoint of koshering the hotel, but the General Assembly, I was a labor Zionist, raising money for Israel, which was, the government was labor Zionist. That was hand in glove. I even got 4 people who were either labor Zionists themselves or associated with labor Zionists on the staff of Federation. And then when I become the executive, who comes to the General Assembly that we have to greet? The member of the Likud party, Begin, the arch enemy. It was so ironic, you know. Beyond that, other events during that time, I mentioned the bicentennial.
What about how
the Russians were an issue in our time, big issue. My involvement, other than, you know, the usual thing with the way we would get the money from Hayas and for the resettlement service, etc., was when the FBI came to visit me. They wanted the addresses, the business addresses of where people work, job addresses. I said, it's a Jewish family, sir. You have to go to them. They run that agency. We don't. At any rate, they sent a director of the FBI, a regional director. Look, we need it. I said, you're very persuasive if you can influence them as to why. And I kept it, you know, away from the other members of both staff and laity. I figured there was no point in having a discussion. That's something they should do. But it was a couple of tense days and meetings for me. The other item that I wanted to mention, if I can find it, well, of course, the mini missions were something. Again, it fit in with my pattern. And there was something which I supported because I felt it would provide dual benefits, but I can neither think of it or find it on here. But when I think of it, okay.
How you holding up? Got time for a couple more?
A couple more quickies, yeah. We'll do it. Whatever you think.
I'm just curious.
Yeah.
You know, Detroit always had the reputation of going far beyond their numbers in terms of their generosity.
Mm-hmm.
And and whether it was, you took the Federation through a number of wars, 67, 73,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. What do you think was the reason that Detroit was the fifth largest community, or the eighth largest community, and it was the third largest or the second largest contributing?
Yeah,
community?
I assume there were a lot of factors. I can't help but think, that the anti-Semitic period that we went through in the 30s, that many of our people, our experience, were aware of, it didn't play some role in that. Detroit were always good fundraisers. It was always a good fundraising community. My brother, for a while, was educational director at Temple Bethel. And my brother and I had a pattern where every Sunday we would sit in his office at home and schmooze about a variety of things. And he gave me, Irving Katz's book and other about the history. And I was impressed with people I didn't even know, like David Brown, who was a major fundraiser nationally in the general community. And there were a lot of people. Fred Butzel was very involved in the general community. That was the pre-World War II era, when there was Jewish involvement, and the Jews who had major department stores and others downtown were all looked to. I mean, Sam's Cut Rate was the sponsor for the Detroit Symphony, where Chambers, or whatever his name was involved with the anti-Semitic newsletter. But we were involved, and that history had some impact, I think, on our. And then I think Sobey and Fred Butzel was a factor. Max Fisher was a huge factor. There's one thing to being good. There's another to being able to maintain it. And someone always came along. Maybe it's Gilbert now. I don't know. Whoever you have, we see his ads here, Quicken Loans or something. very bright. You don't get a mortgage anymore. You get a urage, something that just fits you, you know. Guys, something else. And the fact that, you know, we weren't involved in the general philanthropies until, you know, much later in our history, all of those things, you know, contributed to it. And Sobey made a big, there was no fundraiser to match Sobey, and no organizer to match Sobey, and no administrator to match Sobey in the field. We were just very fortunate to have him. Tragic that his career ended, you know, in Los Angeles the way it did. But he was always exhilarating. I remember seeing him once, and his vision was pretty gone, and Mrs. Sobolov, you remember her name. At any rate, had already passed away, and he said, you know, I have a high school girl who comes in and reads to me, and someone who comes to clean, and someone who handles my checkbook. He says, but I still have a vacancy. I said, what kind of a vacancy? I need a personnel director, you know. He was just an extraordinary human being. Yeah. Okay.
And any closing words about the state of the world that we're in?
No.
Of the Jewish people?
No. Nothing. You have to come to my men's club, coffee club, every Thursday.
Maybe we'll do that.
Yeah, and you'll hear that. I do think that, you know, federations, the agencies, you know, they're fairly large businesses. And while I think we're training the workers, the soldiers fairly well in a variety of programs, we're not doing as well by the generals. I don't know that you can run an organization with a $12 million pretty complicated budget, or a $20 million pretty complex budget, without having an executive who either has an MBA or at least has some business training, or an institution that doesn't have a chief financial officer. You know, it's awfully hard to do it, and unless you're able to do it, you suffer. Although I see a lot of companies that have all of that, and they suffer too. But you know, I think that would be helpful along the way, make a difference. And there is some work being done in terms of training executives at the universities. I think Stanley Frankel's involved in something. Max Fisher was involved with something at Brandeis, so that would make a difference. Beyond that, you know, I think of my own hometown and the decline of the auto industry, and what's happened to the city is, you know, only the decades will give the answer to that. I'm afraid there aren't any shortcuts.
You're hopeful?
Yeah. Well, farming has become a big business.
Yeah.
You know, very valuable. Yeah. Anything else in closing?
No.
That occurs to you?
This has been my privilege to do this,
Okay.
and I apprate that you've taken the time to do it.
Did I miss anything
I don't know.
that I wanted to say? As I said to you earlier, I want to get on the record as many of those things as I possibly can, because, you know, someday Federation's going to do a history from the Six-Day War on to the present, and at least there'll be one place where everything that I could think of was put down and available, and whatever Bolkowski historian you get to do that will be able to turn to that. Offhand, obviously the Maple Drake thing was a big issue in my time. We built, that was Irwin Shaw's involvement, built the biggest Jewish community center in the country, and we had the biggest fiscal problems. Sobey and Bill had taken care of the Sabbath issue in a respectable fashion, but the income issue was, and it was a dilemma. Social agencies, don't have the capital, the borrowing capacity to go out and bring their system, their health club, up to date every 6 months in competition with the private clubs that surround them. So it's pretty hard to stay ahead of the game. The other big thing in my time was the Holocaust Memorial Center. I was eager to have it at the center, and we spent an awful lot of time trying to convince them and convince the center, and we finally did. And motivation was, I felt it would be helpful, it would have a dual benefit. There would be some control of the Holocaust Memorial Center, which wasn't an agency, but and that it would benefit the center in terms of the presence of possible members and people in the community. It had some benefits, and then of course,
didn't quite work out.
yeah, you knew from the beginning that you were working with an executive at the Holocaust Memorial Center who needed complete control. And while we were able to keep him in check for a number of years, I don't think it had to do with my departure. It would have happened no matter what. Yeah, he and I, spent a lot of time together. But
one of the accomplishments, I think, that can be attributed to you, and it's something that is burgeoning all over the country, particularly as the Jewish population ages, and with others too, is the whole issue of endowment. I thought maybe it would be worthwhile you're saying a word or two about endowment. In our program at Federation that you clearly began.
Well, it happened sort of, I'll give it to you organically. Early on, federations in Detroit and all around the country would occasionally get a check from an estate, a person who had been a contributor and wanted to leave something to a number of institutions. Sometimes they would get something pretty substantial from someone whose commitment to the Federation was so great that they left a large portion of their estate. I think of Judge Simons and his wife, who left almost $500,000 fairly early on. But one day I got a check in the mail. I think it was from David Cohn, but I'm not entirely sure, for $5,000 from the estate. And I went in to Sobey and Bill and I said, I know what happens to these. Either Federation uses it to bolster the campaign, or it used for some other purpose. I'd like to suggest that it would be nice. This fellow was a contributor most of his life. He left a $5,000, gave us a $5,000 check. I'd like to set up, for the time being, a fund, Allied Jewish Campaign Perpetual Endowment Fund. And that was at a time, when that was not at that time, a little later on, we came to the point where we actually organized it. This was before I was an executive. The boys were still around, and our campaigns were always very good. We may not have, as Sobey always used to say, they argue with us about percentage of the money, how much of it goes to Israel, how much of it goes for domestic purposes. He would always say, look, would you rather have a percentage of a smaller amount or a larger allocation? That's the way it always was. The arguments were in towns where they were giving not so well, and they wanted a higher percentage to go overseas. But our campaign, as you had pointed out earlier, was so successful that the way in which we divided the funds, which in the earlier days, post-war days, after the establishment of Israel, was pretty much 50-50. Our 50% was a much higher amount of dollars than the 60% that another community was giving for. So he always pointed out the obvious, that you're better off this way. So he said, yeah, put it in the fund. Put it in a fund. So we did that, and a few additional checks came in that were not designated. And when we had 35, 40 checks in the fund, contributions, I said, you know, now's the time to institute, and this is before we had a full endowment, an Allied Jewish Campaign Permanent Endowment Fund. And the principle was a simple one. These are people who had given to the Federation, to the campaign, most of their lives. They may not have been involved in the Federation, but they gave. And they gave to the Federation because there was a need, and they believed that the Federation would divide it in a way which reflects their interests and reflects the needs that exist. So why not get them to give a perpetual endowment? They will then know that they're giving something which will support the community at home and overseas in exactly the same fashion as it did during their lifetime. So we set it up. Later on, when Joe Jacquier, I think, was the chairman of the United Jewish Charities, and I think Jack Miller was the chairman of the endowment fund, the general chairman, I said, you know, it's time to create an endowment program. There was a lot of resistance to endowments, particularly from the friends of overseas, of Israel. So I said, let's have a 5-pronged campaign. Give for an Allied Jewish Campaign Permanent Endowment Fund. Give for Federation services of Federation agencies, and the Jewish Home for Aged and the Fresh Air Society already had a small fund. So there'll be one for aged, one for camping, and the Sinai Hospital wants to set up a medical endowment fund. And we'll have a $100 million campaign. Well, Zuckerman lashed out at me. I said, Paul, we're setting up a fund that'll put money in the campaign. People who aren't around making pledges, you know. Your and my interests are taken care of, you know. Well, he finally relented, and he was something of a friend. He had given to the hospital, and we had our first medical endowment fund meeting at Citron's home. And we got the elder Pritzker to come here shortly after he had given $25 million or something to the university, is it Northwestern or some university near Chicago, and name the medical school in the Pritzker name. You know, we raised a few dollars, nothing significant, but we started the idea. I always was an advocate of my child, you know, the Allied Jewish Campaign Permanent Endowment Fund. I thought that's what would appeal to most people. If you have an overriding interest in some one area, then, you know, you can set up an endowment there. But you certainly haven't. Your lifetime of giving has demonstrated an interest in this fund. Why not? And had some successes. When we formally set it up, the endowment fund and the permanent Allied Jewish Campaign Fund, interest rates was the Reagan years, interest rates were high. So we had another carrot. We could offer 10% growth. We were getting 15, but we could offer 10% growth for the fund, and that appealed to people. And I said it has another purpose. There's money on the shelf that's available to us. It'll help on our collections as well. And I said that to Zuckerman in terms of collections. So we instituted it. It's grown as big as it did because I understand the person we had talked to a lot and Gelly worked on a lot was Bielfield. And if I'm not mistaken, it was an 8-figure sum that he, 8 figures. Yeah. 8-figure sum that he got. Was it 10 or 20? I think it was 10. 10, yeah, 10 million. I had once heard a figure of 60 million. And that means $6 million a year goes into the campaign right away, or $4 million, whatever the percentage happens to be at the time. It's a wonderful way to assure security for the community and to make the Federation more of a personal institution, that the family will see thereafter that their father, their grandfather, not only was a lifetime contributor, but was also felt it was important enough that it should be perpetuated. Maybe that'll have an impact on them as well. So that was the endowment program that I'm pretty sure was started during Jack Keir's administration.
Yeah.
Wasn't? Yeah.
Pretty revolutionary too at the time.
Yeah, and some communities have tried. When I would tell that to other executives or to nonprofits in Detroit, they thought that we have such immediate needs that we can't do that. And I noticed that there is a huge temptation to set up other monies that will be available for purposes that aren't part of the regular programs that are supported by the campaign of various beneficiaries. You like to be able, if you're a leader, either executive or either lay or professional, to be able to direct, additional funds for. So there was a period where the Allied Jewish Campaign Fund was sort of denigrated. You have to do what you have to do, I guess.
Yeah, but it still has value. I mean,
yeah, it still makes a difference,
right.
And
Makes a difference.
I don't know that it's being promoted as fully as it should. It's certainly the people who are participants in it aren't recognized as much as they should. Even if it's, a card that goes out annually to the family.
Well, I know.
Yeah.
I have a fund.
Yeah.
For my father.
Yeah.
I get a report every
Yeah,
year.
you get a report, right, on what's in it, and I assume they're sending reports. They have to be, I think, sending reports out on that. But just like, I wanted that there should be recognition of major Allied Jewish Campaign donors. We put it into the annual. Why, a person makes a capital gift, and their name is on a building or an auditorium or a library forever. Although I think we're moving over to where nonprofits are moving over, namely it's a time-limited gift unless it's stretched way beyond the original amount. But people who have given 40, 50, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 million dollars in their lifetime aren't recognized. I think it's double-edged. It makes some people who talk about the oligarchs say, see, but I'm more concerned about the people who gave the money and their families than I am about the critics.
Well, at least we have the wall in the Federation building with
Oh, does that?
all of the people in their cumulative giving.
Yeah,
There is
okay.
a
Yeah, right.
wall.
It did move over from there. Okay, glad to hear that.
All right.